Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Indie Alaska is an innovative weekly web series capturing the diverse and colorful lifestyle of Alaskans. Real stories of everyday Alaskans at work and play. Supported in part by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It is the 9th of January. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your latest weather information, whether that's using Marine VHF, your NOAA Weather Radio, or finding us online at weather.gov/Alaska. You can do that also by calling the Weather Info line at 800-472-0391 or connecting with us on Facebook, on Twitter, or on YouTube during the afternoon. Of course, you'll get your daily afternoon map briefing around 4 o'clock or so. Today's hazardous weather includes a freezing rain advisory that will continue until tomorrow morning for areas around the Misty Fjords, areas near Snider. Should also expect the opportunity for some freezing rain. You may see that mix in with snow, but there's a wealth of warm air still kind of lurking around in the Gulf, and that's going to keep the precipitation type around the Gulf Coast communities kind of questionable through the rest of the weekend. So it's not just southeastern Alaska, though you may see some higher amounts than other places. There may be times where you see some at least light or patchy freezing rain mixing in with just plain old rain or even some snow at times. So kind of a milder weather system lurking in the Gulf right now. Let's turn our attention a little bit further out to the west. Low pressure sitting north and west of Nunivak Island here off the YK Delta. That's spinning, and that's been dragging some warm air northward for the last several days, so very mild conditions continue here across southwestern Alaska, as anywhere in the YK knows right now. And a little bit further west, another area of low pressure here sitting just south of the Kamchatka Peninsula, and several other waves associated along that main boundary, all trying to slowly shift northward a little bit. So we'll continue to see that milder flow working its way northward. But that boundary right now is still sitting just along and south of the Aleutian chain. A look further northward shows that we're getting more of an east and northeasterly flow. We've got high pressure building up across the Chukchi Seacoast, and if that could be stronger, that would push colder air further southward, but it's not going to. It looks like that pattern right now is going to push its way more east and southeast, then dropping southward into the Bering Sea. So right now we're kind of in a milder flow that looks like that's going to continue at least into the early to mid part of next week. Now, as we go across the rest of the state of Alaska, you'll notice another wave of low pressure south of the Haida Gwaii region. That's keeping that warm and wet air working its way into southeastern Alaska, and with areas around the Misty Fjords region, looking at that overrunning where we've got milder air aloft, but at the surface you've got cold enough air that if anything falls into it, it refreezes or gets pretty close to it and keeps the surface temperatures cold. So if it's raining on top, by the time it hits those cold metal surfaces like your car or like a tree or a power line, it could freeze on contact. That's what freezing rain is. And across the interior, plenty of cloud cover. That should start to break up a little bit as we get into the heart of the weekend. But for right now, you're probably looking at more clouds than anything else, and probably a few flurries around the Fairbanks region as we go into Saturday and Sunday. There's that low pressure system just west of Nunivak Island again. You can see how it's affecting the weather across all of the interior, literally pulling in those clouds from the east and southeast and wrapping them into the Bering Strait communities. For South Central, it should be more of a tamer weekend. Looks like many areas will still be dealing with some spotty precipitation around Prince William Sound, some of that heavier at times than others. But for most areas from Kodiak Island all the way through the Cook Inlet region, we'll probably start to see more fog than just plain old cloud cover, and the chance for precipitation is going away. As we look at the rest of the weather pattern, you can see the cold air is still massed up across the north and western sections of Canada and the northern parts of the Yukon, and the drier weather moving into south and western Alaska and the Alaska Peninsula. Well, it's been fairly blustery the last couple days, but it looks like a lot of the winds have been subsiding. Yesterday, gusts in that area were upwards of 30 to 60 miles per hour. The same goes for areas around Prince William Sound. Even parts of the interior were fairly blustery. A lot of that seems to have settled down at this point. Here's the weather chart for this afternoon, a 991 millibar low that we're looking at just west of Nunivak Island, a frontal boundary south of the chain. That occlusion is trying to work its way northward, but it's running into high pressure that extends out to the west across the southern Bering at 1,007 millibars, and low pressure just south and west of Sitka at 1,003 millibars is bringing in some slightly cooler air, trying to move that into the archipelago. Not having great success, but that rain, again, could be freezing rain at times, so keep a watch on that. Any snow across the interior at this point looks to be pretty light. We have seen some reports of snow showers, but chances are most of what you'll see around the Fairbanks and Deltana areas probably going to be flurries, if anything. You'll notice high pressure out across the Chukchi Sea is bringing in more of a northerly flow, so Barrow could be looking at some light snow. The same goes for the Brooks Range as colder air is trying to drop southward into the coastal plain and eventually into northwestern Canada. Watch out for areas around Kotzebue Sound and parts of the northern YK Delta and Norton Sound region itself. You could be looking at some periods of freezing rain and some sleet on top of just plain old rain. It's been raining in Nome today with temperatures hovering in the low to mid 30s. Amazing stuff. Colder air continues to hover across the coastal plain from Prudhoe Bay to Kaktovik tomorrow, a 1,034 millibar high across the Chukchi Sea coast. That's going to keep more of a easterly flow working across the Bering Strait. There's plenty of ice there, and more ice is forming. We'll check that in just a bit. For areas in the inner waterways for southeast, look for periods of rain and snow and maybe some freezing rain again. Pockets of rainfall across the Prince William Sound, the eastern side of the Kenai Peninsula down to Kodiak Island, and a better chance for some steadier rainfall with an east and southeasterly wind for the central and western chain with gales up there, and also across the Chukchi Sea coast, especially over the Beaufort Sea coast where gales are in effect right now and into tomorrow. As we go into Sunday, that frontal boundary up north doesn't move too much, and the bulk of the cold air stays up north, and any cold air that does escape is probably going to drop into Canada. It will be cool, if not seasonably cold there across the interior. Watch for more and more of those clouds to break up, so if you look in the right spot as you get into Sunday, you'll have a better chance of seeing the sun. And out across southwestern Alaska, you'll see fewer clouds through the day, probably a partly sunny afternoon in places like Newtok and Bethel and down toward southwestern Alaska into perhaps Dillingham and King Salmon, though you'll be a little bit more in the bulk of the cloud cover the further south you go. Low pressure across the central chain at 975 millibars will keep that south and easterly flow going. That means moisture is traveling northward, and so is the warm air. And you'll notice another wave of low pressure a little bit further out on the western side of the map. For southeast, pockets of rainfall continue there. A better chance for some light snow at elevation. Places like Hyder probably dealing with a better chance of snow. Most of south central should be pretty dry along the road system there. Once you get into the Copper River Basin, you'll see areas of rain and snow mixing in together. Probably some rainfall and shower activity around Prince William Sound, Cordova, and Valdez, and Homer and Seward also looking at some intermittent wet weather. Same goes for Kodiak Island. But once you get north of the Alaska Range, it's more clouds than anything else. Here's temps today. Southeastern Alaska was in the mid to upper 30s. Look at Sitka. Earlier this afternoon, I'm pretty sure I saw temperatures there in the lower 50s for a brief moment. Mid 40s there around Metlakatla out toward Craig. Hyder was 36 degrees. The cold air certainly in the interior areas of Canada there in the teens. Once you get back toward coastal Alaska, 30s and 40s all the way around Prince William Sound and the Kenai Peninsula. Kodiak was 43 today. Southwestern Alaska was in the mid 30s. Once you get north of the Alaska Range, temperatures dropped into the teens, but even Fairbanks was 20 degrees. It's early January. That's pretty warm stuff. 20 degrees there, 16 in Eagle, 1 around Northway, 9 degrees around Volcano, 1 for Fort Yukon, 3 in Arctic Village. Anaktuvik Pass was up to 21 degrees. That tells you how shallow that cold air is. Once you get up a little bit higher in elevation, we're back in that warm air. For the coastal plain and the Arctic coast itself, anywhere from about 2 below in Barrow to 7 below around Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse to low to mid-teens for the Chukchi Sea coast. From Wainwright, a little bit further south into Kotzebue Sound, we saw temperatures approaching 30 degrees in Kivalina around 3 o'clock. Nome was 32, as I mentioned. There was some rain around Elam, all the way down around toward Unalakleet, Galena, and Ruby. Temperatures in the teens and 20s there. Grayling 21, 30 around Hooper Bay, and 34 in Nunivak. Island and 30 in Bethel this afternoon. Mid to upper 30s for the Alaska Peninsula, False Pass and Cold Bay, very close to 40 degrees this afternoon. St. Paul and St. George both at 35, 36 for Atka, 36 in Adak, and Shemya was showing 35. Mild air continues to move northward, and overnight low temperatures in many places from southwest Alaska to Kodiak Island and the Chain, all looking at readings above freezing tonight. 26 in Nome, 3 below in Barrow, and for the interior, look for temperatures hovering around 4 for Fairbanks. South Central in the mid to upper 20s, Kodiak 36, southeast in the low to mid 30s. Many places south of Sitka will be closer to 40 degrees with high temps tomorrow back in the upper 30s and lower 40s for you. Teens once you get into the interior and parts of the Copper River Basin. For the Middle Tanana Valley, probably upper teens and low to mid 20s there for the Arctic coast, from about 5 below to 5 above. Kotzebue Sound temperatures in the 20s. Shishmaref looking at 20 degrees, and lower to mid 20s for Nome tomorrow. Look for the lower and middle Yukon Valley to see temps in the upper 20s and lower 30s. Bristol Bay also looking at temperatures at or above freezing in the Alaska Peninsula, closer to 40 degrees. Flying weather then, expect IFR conditions for parts of the Arctic coast and the coastal plain. A better chance for IFR conditions there for the central and western Aleutians, and widespread MVFR conditions for most of southeastern Alaska. As you look at the pass conditions for Anaktuvuk Pass, expect MVFR conditions throughout the day. Probably similar conditions there for Adigan Pass as you go into your Saturday. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass will go back and forth, probably seeing some snow showers at times in the pass, but you may see some pockets of VFR throughout the day, so watch for that. Rainy Pass, similar conditions there. Maybe some snow showers in the region. Might move all the way over to VFR, but kind of iffy on that. Windy Pass has a better chance of hovering around VFR throughout most of the day. Isabel Pass will be close as well, probably VFR if I had to guess, but MVFR conditions will be lurking in the region. And Mentasta Pass looks to be VFR. Same goes for Tanita Pass, some improvements there. Portage Pass we're going to call IFR, especially on the Prince William Sound side with snow showers and rain showers very close to the region. Once you get into the west, there will be some fog in the area up around the Cook Inlet, so watch for that to restrict visibility. Chilkoot and White Pass, we expect to see MVFR conditions throughout the day. Here's the freezing levels, and you can see that warm air aloft is pushed way up along the Parks Highway and northward and just west of Denali. 2,000 feet there, 4,000 foot freezing levels right around southeastern Alaska, and the surface freezing line itself pretty close to the Gulf Coast, but inland and then northward toward St. Lawrence Island with warmer air aloft across the eastern parts of the Beaufort Seacoast. Icing potential, there's plenty of pockets of light to isolated moderate out there. Probably above 6,000 feet is where you'll find the bulk of that. Some of that also lingering along a frontal boundary for the central and western Aleutians above 6,000 feet, and also across southeastern Alaska for the Copper River Basin down toward Yakutat, and then south of Sitka toward Craig, Metlakatla, and all the way up toward Petersburg, and just to the south of Juneau there for light to isolated moderate concerns. The jet stream shows the power of the Pacific jet right now. Look at this. Wind speeds from 170 to 190, almost 200 knots out here across the central and western Pacific. If you were taking a flight right now, and you better believe they are, the jet traffic right now anywhere from Eastern Asia just zipping in probably close to a record time to make that trans-Pacific journey. That is pretty impressive stuff. Similar things happening right now across the North Atlantic. Folks flying from New York all the way out toward the British Isles are seeing just lightning fast travel times thanks to the powerful jet stream. On the other side of that, though, is a much weaker but reverse flow of that jet from east to west. Winds there from 65 to 70 knots. But the one that's really changing our weather is the northwesterly flow coming out of the Arctic. That's dropping the wind speeds around 85 to 90 knots, and that's shunting a lot of that cold air into the Midwestern lower 48 states. And as that happens, we remain mild right here across the last frontier. Now, as we look at 9,000 feet, high pressure is working its way up the eastern side of the Gulf. Those winds coming in from the east and southeast are working their way into southwestern Alaska and the Bering Sea, drawn in by low pressure north and west of St. Matthew, and continued by several other waves of low pressure out across the North Pacific. Wind speeds there around 30 to 40 knots. You can see light winds across the interior, about 10 to 15, and more of a light northwesterly flow across the central and eastern sections of southeastern Alaska. That ridge also extends northward a little bit. If you're going to run into any widespread turbulence, chances are that's going to be in the gaps there across the Alaska Peninsula, and on the south side of the chain. Most areas are dealing with relatively light winds, we'll say 20 knots or so across the interior. You might find a little more chop there across north and western sections of the Arctic coast, especially north of Barrow. Those wind speeds and eastward coming up to about 40 to 50 knots or so. So Kaktovik and Barrow out toward Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse might see a little bit stronger push from the northwest. Here's what we're seeing as far as turbulence goes for tomorrow. Again, we're going to watch any developments there north of the Arctic coast. Probably a greater threat there as you head into northern sections of Canada and the northern Yukon Territory specifically, below 4,000 feet. Around the Bering Strait and just west of St. Lawrence Island, things probably looking a little more choppy there. Below 4,000, you run into some occasional moderate and a little more lesser chance there as you head into north and south locations from that point. Around the central and western Aleutians, generally below 4,000 feet, also looking at some threats for light to isolated moderate. Most other areas not seeing anything too much out of the ordinary. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back in just a few minutes with a look at your ice edge and, of course, your marine weather. Stay tuned.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ed Cornfield. On behalf of the Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation and Alaska Public Media, welcome to another edition of Hangar Flying. My guest tonight is John Hartke. I've asked him to come back to talk to us about some of the unique flying that he's done. Welcome back to Hangar Flying, John.
Thank you, Ed.
So last week we discussed, or last time we discussed your Air Force career. What I'd like to do is, we've got a picture that's coming up now, and maybe just talk about that a little bit. Coming up on the screen. Yep, there it is. Just what is that?
Okay, that was my last job in the Air Force, and that was flying the F-4 Phantom, both in training German Air Force pilots as well as the U.S. Air Force drone program. All four of those aircraft are drones that are destined to be shot down in missile testing and such for the U.S. Air Force and other weapon systems our nation has. But anyhow, they're also flying out in formation over the ocean at Tyndall Air Force Base near Panama City, Florida. The F-4 was a very interesting airplane to fly, a little bit older technology than some of the other airplanes I flew. It was a real nice airplane to fly formation and very, very light at the controls for an airplane that was that large.
Okay. So you're also a member of the Commemorative Air Force. So maybe briefly tell us what the mission of the Commemorative Air Force is and your involvement.
Well, the mission of the Commemorative Air Force is to keep some of the older aircraft from the World War II era flying so that folks today can hear and see the sights and sounds. It's the way they were used to some of the airplanes that led up to where we currently are. In Alaska, we are very fortunate to have 2 airplanes in the Commemorative Air Force. Harvard, which is the same as a T-6 Texan or the SNJ that the Navy flew. And we also have a BT-13 that we're very fortunate that Mike Hunt donated to the Commemorative Air Force. I've been fortunate to fly with the Commemorative Air Force up here for about 5 years, and it's an opportunity I never expected to have in my lifetime.
And there's also, there's another picture that's coming up on the screen now. Should be, yeah, there it is. So tell us about this one.
Well, this is a picture taken back in November, I think the 11th of November to be exact. It was on Veterans Day. We had done a flyby over the cemetery commemorating Veterans Day. And then we also went out and did some formation training. Myself and Pat Miller are in the lead airplane. He took the picture. And then it's Rob Renner Cricket in the silver airplane, and then Ed Cornfield, who I'm speaking with here in the yellow Harvard, which is the Commemorative Air Force airplane. But we're practicing formation flying in this photo. And to do that, it requires a little bit of skill. It's a 3-dimensional, obviously forward and backwards, up and down, and so on. But it's something that you can't stay good at if you're not constantly practicing it. And it is a challenge, and it can be difficult, but once you get used to it, it's not so bad. And to liken it to driving down the Glen Highway in your car, you're 6 feet away from the car to your left or right, and you can stay even to them in and out. That's formation flying in 2 dimensions. in 3 dimensions is what you do with an airplane.
Mm-hmm. So there are many different opportunities in the Commemorative Air Force. Obviously volunteers, some pilot opportunities, so maybe you can just touch on those, some of those opportunities. What if I wanted to fly one of those warbirds?
Well, in the Commemorative Air Force, we have our meetings every Thursday at Merrill Field at 6 o'clock, and we have a number of members. Probably the biggest responsibility we have is taking care of the airplanes, keeping them clean, keeping them maintained and ready for flight. Then the other things that we do is in flying and making sure that we have the correct proficiency to fly them safely, as well as getting other folks instruction to get checked out into new members who would like to fly them as well.
Now, you also have BT-13, and there's a rides program. What's that all about?
Yes, it's again part of the mission of the Commemorative Air Force, and not just having the airplanes to demonstrate to fly for people, but to take folks along flying in them so that they can see what the actual sights and sounds were like from a perspective inside the airplane.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. I'm going to put one more picture up here. We're almost out of time, but this picture is of kind of a unique airplane that you also get to fly. What is that?
That's a Ford trimotor, and I'm privileged to be one of the folks flying with the EAA. They have a Ford trimotor, one that they own and one that they're leasing, and they have a rides program that they're doing throughout the lower 48. Similar mission to the Commemorative Air Force, but to show the airplanes the way it was done a long time ago. And it's a really neat, very stately airplane, 1929, 1931 vintage, that used to be the way that folks would travel if they're well off, and at just a different pace of life. And
there's a picture of the inside, which I think is pretty small. But anyway, John, thank you very much for joining us on Hangar Flying, and we appreciate you coming talking about your experiences and telling us your story. Thanks very much, folks, and fly safe.
And of course, another episode of Hangar Flying comes your way on Monday. Here's a look at today's sea ice edge, and obviously a lot of coverage here, but a lot of that sea ice across southwest Alaska and across the Bering Strait and around St. Lawrence Island is not very thick at all. So a lot of small thickness or low thickness there across a large chunk of the Bering Sea so far. And with the warmer air that's moving northward and continuing to wrap around low pressure here, that's not going to increase that concentration or thickness in rapid form. So stay tuned for more. As always, you can check out the Sea Ice Outlook and maps like this anytime you want, including some high-res satellite imagery as you're able at weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php as analyzed by our Sea Ice Desk team. As you look at southeast, winds will be pretty light across the inner waterways there, ranging around 10 knots or so from the north in the Lynn Canal, and across Stevens Passage is a little bit more from the east, and as you get into Clarence Strait, a little bit more southeast, but all around 10 knots or so with 2-foot seas. As you get into the coastal areas, that's about 10 to 25 knots, the strongest of which will be across the northern entrances. We've got a little bit more of a northerly flow, though, coming out of Yakutat and Icy Cape looking at 10 knots with a 4-foot sea. By Sunday, that's a little more uniform in all areas. A broader southeasterly flow coming up through the inner waterways at 15 knots with 3-foot seas there. 20 to 25 knots there from about Gustavus and the northern entrances all the way down to the Dixon entrance, and 6 to 9-foot seas are expected with more of an easterly flow coming off land now in Yakutat around 15 knots with a 4-foot sea. As you look at Saturday, a north and easterly flows coming down through Cook Inlet and Prince William Sound, also the north and western sections of the Gulf, about 10 to 15 knots in most areas. A little bit of a stronger flow east of the Barren Islands with a 7-foot sea, easterlies east of Kodiak Island, and inside of Shelikof Strait, that's 15 knots with a 3-foot sea. By Sunday, really not much of a change, just a little bit more of a tilt toward the east. So an east to westerly flow coming across the north and western Gulf. Northeasterlies picking up a little bit more inside of Prince William Sound. North and easterly winds still working through Cook Inlet, and easterlies up to 20 knots now west of the Barrens, and a little bit of a stronger flow on either side of Kodiak Island, 25 to 30 knots with 6-foot seas inside of Shelikof and 9-foot seas on the eastern side of Kodiak. As you get into the Alaska Peninsula, a broad easterly flow, about 20 to 25 knots, 4-foot seas on the Bering side, 6 to 7-foot seas on the Pacific side, and that picks up a little bit more on Sunday from the east, still looking at 30 knots with 10-foot seas and 5 to 8-foot seas developing on the Bering side, 5-foot seas, in fact, inside of Bristol Bay at 30 knots. For the Aleutians, 25 to 35 knots for most areas in the Bering and 30 to 35 knots on the Pacific side. You're looking at 10 to 15-foot seas on the Pacific and 6 to as high as 15, even 16-foot seas out across the western part of the chain. As you get into Sunday, you can see some changes here with that next low pressure system creeping in. You get more of a southwesterly flow from Kiska and then out toward Attu. That changes to more of an easterly flow at 35 knots with a 16-foot sea. You can get northerly winds coming into Atka, but the south and easterly flows developing around Unalaska and Nikolsky and points north and south, looking at more of an east flow on the north side and a southwesterly flow on the south side with seas up to 14 and 15 feet. For the south and west and the Bering Coast, you're looking at southeasterly flow there around St. Lawrence Island, north of Nunivak Island, that's 20 to 30 knots, and watch for some heavy freezing spray. As you get into the St. Matthew Island waters, that's more of a northwesterly flow. Southeasterlies for the Pribilofs with a 6-foot sea. Still plenty of open water there, and 5-foot seas in the Kuskokwim Delta region, 25 knots. That comes up to 30 knots from the east, 25 knots around St. Lawrence Island, and more of a east flow coming across the Pribilofs at 30 knots with a 9-foot sea. For the Arctic coast, we still have gales around the Kaktovik region and just offshore tonight with a westerly flow coming down to 25 knots tomorrow. Otherwise, northerlies coming into Barrow, and you'll probably see some snow in that region as a result. Northeasterly flow coming down the Arctic coast, 20 to 30 knots, and northeasterlies inside of Kotzebue Sound at 30 knots. That diminishes greatly by Sunday down to 15 knots. A broad easterly flow sweeping across the Arctic coast at 15 knots on Sunday. Look for northeasterly winds around Cape Lisburne and more of an easterly flow from Wainwright around 25 knots. They're blowing offshore. Recapping tonight's weather, the greatest weather concern tonight is the opportunity for freezing rain around the misty fjords. Most other areas for the Gulf of Alaska will be dealing with spotty and intermittent precipitation, but it could take all types this weekend, from rain to freezing rain and maybe some snow or maybe a mixture in between. The coldest air is still lurking up north and will try to make a run into northwestern Canada and just grazing northern sections of Alaska this weekend. And we have another storm system and many waves of low pressure lurking in the North Pacific that will try and work their way into the southern Bering. You can see the progression there, but most areas in the interior will be drying out, dealing with more clouds than anything else and a little bit more wind as we look at the Alaska Peninsula by Sunday. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather and have a safe weekend.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.